This is Dateline News and Conversations. You know my guest, Dimitri Lascaris, Canadian-born, has Greek citizenship as well. He's a retired attorney, an activist, and a very active blogger. Dimitri, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Regis. Thank you for having me again.
Well, it's always great, the shows and the times we've gotten together. You have just returned from Lebanon, where you spent the last 7 or 8 days on the border with Israel. Why did you go there, and what is it that you saw?
Well, I actually went to Lebanon for the first time in my life just before I came to Russia and met you. So that would have been in March, and I established contacts with people there, some of whom are Lebanese Canadian, who are journalists, activists, extremely knowledgeable about the country. And I, of course, have been watching very closely what is happening in Gaza. I'm becoming increasingly, frankly, irate about it. I'm very, very upset that my government is supporting this genocide, which is exactly what it is. And the news coverage, predictably, in the Western media was extremely disappointing. So the first thing I did, I felt I had to act in my capacity as a journalist, because that's what I spend most of my time doing nowadays. You mentioned I was a blogger, and I do a lot of on-site reporting in connection with my blogging. The first thing I did was I actually offered my services for free to Al Jazeera if they could get me into Gaza. I know a correspondent there, and he put me in touch with an editor, but she never responded. So then I thought about going to Amman, but Amman was just before I made my decision, I found out that the government had banned protests near the border of the West Bank. So I figured that wasn't going to be particularly useful to go there. And then I decided to go to Lebanon, where at that point in time, hostilities between Israeli forces and Hezbollah militants in the south of Lebanon were intensifying. So I called my contacts, the ones I had made in March. And first thing I did when I got off the plane, it was Wednesday, October 18th. It was the day following the bombing, the atrocious bombing of the Al-Ali hospital by Israeli forces. And I do believe Israeli forces bombed it, despite the denials. So in response to that, Hezbollah called what it termed a national day of rage in Lebanon on the day of my arrival. So I packed up my bags hastily, and I took a flight from Athens to Beirut, and I went directly to the U.S. Embassy in northern Beirut. And when I arrived there, all hell had broken loose. There were well over 1,000 very irate pro-Palestinian protesters. Excuse me. They were clashing with heavily armed Lebanese army soldiers. There was tear gas everywhere. They were throwing rocks at the soldiers. The soldiers were firing rubber bullets. Some of the soldiers picked up the rocks and threw them back at the protesters. And I saw one poor protester on the back of a scooter who went right by me. He had been struck in the eye, and his eye was basically had come out of the socket. It looked like he was going to lose his eye. And a number of people were overcome by the tear gas. And it was just, it was quite an introduction to the situation in Lebanon. And after that, there were a number of protests I attended, but they were no longer at the U.S. Embassy because the Lebanese army effectively blocked access to the U.S. Embassy. These protesters, for all of their efforts, couldn't get within 100 meters of the embassy. And so I then turned my efforts to the south of Lebanon, and I went down to the border to various areas that were being shelled, accompanied by my two guides. I had to rent a flak jacket and a helmet, and we actually saw one village being shelled from a distance. We heard a number of other villages being shelled. We didn't actually see it, but we could hear it. There were drones overhead constantly when we were on the border. And I think the most, nerve-wracking moment was we had to go down a road that was for about 7 minutes that was immediately parallel to the wall that separates Lebanon and Israel, and a civilian vehicle had been shot up by Israeli forces that have watchtowers all along this wall and can see the traffic going by. And at that point in time, we were warned about this, that was a dangerous road, but it was the only way for us to get back to our point of departure. So our driver took us down that road as fast as he could. Fortunately, nothing happened. I spoke to a number of people down there. Many people have been displaced. Some have stayed because, for example, it's the olive harvest season and they couldn't leave their olive trees. They had to go out in the fields and pick the olives. Others stayed because they had businesses or homes that they were afraid to leave unguarded. But most people have been evacuated from the border on both sides. The entire kibbutz of Kiryat Shimona, which is 20,000 people in northern Israel, has been evacuated. And my overall impression of what I saw is that, this is an interpretation, and it could be incorrect, but my interpretation was that Israel is the more aggressive of the two sides on the border between Israel and Lebanon. They're launching more attacks than Hezbollah, and in fact, Hezbollah has sustained significantly more casualties than those reported by the Israeli military. And I would go so far as to say that I almost had the sense that Israel's military was trying to provoke Hezbollah. I can't prove that, and I could be wrong about it, but that was the sense that I had from the overall balance of violence that I witnessed. And one might ask, well, why would they do that? I think their motivation for doing that, if in fact that's what they're trying to do, is that it will draw the United States military into this conflict. I think the Israelis understand painfully well, they'll never admit it, that if they get into a two-front war with Hamas and Hezbollah, especially given the missile arsenal that Hezbollah now possesses, they're in real trouble. But they want to get rid of Hezbollah desperately. It's the one military force on Israel's borders that is hostile to Israel's military and that is capable of actually inflicting serious damage on Israel's military. And they want the Americans to do the dirty work for them. So I think that might be a motivation for them to provoke a major attack from Hezbollah, bring the United States into the conflict.
I want to come back to that, Dimitri, but I want to first establish the fact you're not just a tourist journalist who decided to jump over there during this conflict. You have been on two of the Freedom Flotilla campaigns. You have been there several times to Israel and Palestine. You're very familiar with the area. You're really not very far away. You're living in Greece right now. So I just wanted to establish that. You have been on top of this for a number of years and obviously very pro the Palestinian cause. The Freedom Flotilla was designed to try to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's get back to the conflict, because of all the people reporting, you are as knowledgeable, I think, as anybody. And so I'm so grateful to you for finding the time to come on the show and talk about this with me. I need to be informed, and all of my viewers need to be informed. Let's get back to October 7th. In your mind, based on your contacts there with people and having followed this, what really happened on October 7th?
Well, there are two possibilities. I'll tell you the possibility that I personally think is more likely. I don't exclude the other possibility at all, given who we're dealing with here. But I think that what happened was, over a period of years, the Israeli military and government became increasingly arrogant and dismissive of the threat posed by Hamas. and the government was riven by internal divisions over the last year. This is a highly controversial government. I mean, all Israeli governments should be controversial given that they've been committing apartheid for decades. But this one was particularly controversial, that led by Netanyahu, whose power depends upon support of, openly racist and far-right extreme elements in Israeli society. So there were massive protests in Israel going on the last 6 months, and Netanyahu's government turned the military's attention, directed the military to reallocate forces from the border with Gaza into the West Bank, because these far-right elements in Netanyahu's government were demanding aggressive expansion of the illegal settlements, which are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention in the West Bank. So they needed to send military forces there to protect these, quite frankly, criminal settlers, these thieves. And as a result of that, the Gaza border was lightly defended. Hamas proved to be much more resourceful than people had imagined. And it appears, I think everybody is in agreement on this much. This was planned over a long period of time by the leaders of Hamas. And they managed to take the Israelis by surprise at a moment of weakness, at a moment of complacency, and inflicted quite serious damage on military forces. And it was by far, I think, the most significant military accomplishment of any Palestinian faction in the history of this 75-year conflict. So that's I think, the more plausible interpretation of what happened. There's another, I think, realistic, although less plausible interpretation, and that is reports emerged in the Israeli press that the Egyptians had wind of this operation before it was launched and warned Netanyahu himself, not only lower level officials within his government, but the warnings went directly to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu ignored them. Again, this is just a theory. Ignored them because he wanted a pretext to impose what one might call a final solution on Gaza, which is to say flattening the strip, the densely populated strip, making it completely uninhabitable and forcing the 2+ million people who reside there into the Sinai, effectively ethnically cleansing it. He needed some kind of a pretext in order to commit a horror of that magnitude before the eyes of the world. And so he, in effect, allowed the attack to happen. Again, I don't think that's the more likely scenario, but given who we're dealing with, Netanyahu is a monster. He's a monster. He's capable of anything. I think he would readily sacrifice, significant number of his own citizens in order to achieve his objectives. But it's a theory at this stage.
Well, I've been following this from a distance, and I've been having conversations with a number of different people, but I have to tell you, the first thing that came to mind to me when I started hearing about this was Israel's 9/11, I went, oh my God, the similarities are so close and obvious to me. Here you had 9/11, that Washington, D.C., that entire area was not protected by surveillance. They didn't detect anything. And the United States forces that were supposed to be there were off doing an exercise somewhere else. I read and I heard videotape on YouTube from Israeli military people who had been involved in the surveillance of the wall, all of these very sensitive instruments that they've had that can detect a fly or a flea that's crossing over that border. They said there's no way that this could happen, that Hamas could do this strike without somebody in Israel knowing what was going on. And I thought, that sounds just like what happened at 9/11. So I started thinking, well, could this have been a conspiracy. You mentioned Netanyahu was capable of anything. He was in really serious political trouble leading up to this election, wanted to do away with the court system and make it subservient to the parliament because supposedly he might be charged and accused of corruption. And so he needed this to put an end, supposedly, to Hamas. But, Dimitri, I also have been reading in multiple places where Netanyahu and Israel actually funded and created Hamas. I want you to just reflect on that, because that theory, if we want to call it that, is out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think actually, I don't think it's, although I've heard a lot of people say this, but it's quite accurate to say that Israel created Hamas. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood has been around for many decades and has, been stood in quite, significant opposition to the state of Israel for many years. And so I think, and there was a real frustration, a genuine frustration amongst large segments of the Palestinian population, a few decades ago at the failure of the Palestinian Liberation Organization to achieve statehood. And people were looking for an alternative. And there were also people who, the Hamas is a religiously oriented Islamic organization, and there are elements within Palestinian society who prefer that kind of government. So I think there were a host of reasons why Hamas came into existence, but there has been, quite ample documentation that once it came into existence, the government of Israel, and particularly Netanyahu, in various ways fostered the growth and the empowerment of Hamas because they wanted to divide Palestinian society and weaken the Palestinian Authority. This has been reported by the mainstream Israeli press, Haaretz, one could call it the paper of record in Israel. Very widely respected paper. I read an article that it published several years ago in which it quoted Netanyahu saying exactly, essentially what I just said. That we are going to foster the growth and the empowerment of Hamas in order to undermine the Palestinian Authority and divide Palestinian society. So I think the evidence is quite clear about that. Now, does that necessarily mean that Netanyahu consciously allowed the October 7th attacks to occur? No, it doesn't necessarily mean it, but it's one more piece of evidence which I think lends some credibility to this theory, and that there was a conspiracy amongst elements of the Israeli government, military, and security services that saw this as an opportunity to create a pretext for the flattening of Gaza and the outright ethnic cleansing of its population.
Okay, you're an attorney. I want to ask you this. As soon as this happened, everybody, from the United States to the European Union to the United Nations, Israel has the right to self-defense. They've been parroting this for years. Now, from a legal point of view, does that justify the incredible, overwhelming, atrocious attacks on civilians that have been committed by Israel? Everybody knows this. It troubles me deeply that the West and the United States are cheering this on. Mm-hmm. A resolution in the United Nations to call a ceasefire, gets humanitarian aid in there to civilians, was defeated. What's your position on Israel's right of self-defense? And do not these Palestinians, who are an occupied people, have the same right of self-defense?
So, of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. Really, nobody needs to be told that. Even people like myself, who have been vigorously critical of the Israeli government for a long time, I've never claimed, suggested, implied that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. This is a straw man. Okay, we don't need to be told that Israel has a right to defend itself. That's not the issue. There are two issues that really we should be talking about. First of all, do the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves as well? And secondly, what is the scope of the right to defend oneself? Okay, so let's deal with the first of those issues. And let me say at the outset that I have been paying careful attention to this issue for years, and because of my being a Westerner and being keenly aware of the fact that Western governments enable Israel's crimes and allow this pipsqueak of a country to get away with the most atrocious violations of international and humanitarian law, I therefore pay careful attention to what Western politicians say. And in all the years, Regis, when I have been listening very carefully, I tell you, I have not one time heard a single elected official of any Western government at any level of government, a national legislature, a provincial or state legislature, a city council, nada, ever say that the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Okay, no one in the political elite of the West acknowledges that they even have the right. They only ever talk about Israel's right. And as a matter of fact, when the October 7th, when the bombardment, this relentless bombardment of Gaza began right after October 7th, I took the trouble to look up the statements of every leader of every European, every Western country in response to the attacks on Gaza by the Israeli military. And every single one of them, I created a list, Regis, and I tweeted it. Every single one of them parroted that line. Israel has a right to defend itself. They were all singing from the same song sheet, just like birds chirping in a flock. None of them said anything about the Palestinian right to defend themselves. The Palestinians have suffered far more civilian casualties, far more than Israel, far more destruction of civilian infrastructure, far more displacement from their homes, far more other forms of, human rights violations, torture, collective punishment, deprivation of the essentials of life, as we're seeing now in Gaza, food, water, fuel being deprived to the population, half of whom are children. And yet no one ever talks about their right to defend themselves. Absolutely obscene. And frankly, it's racist. It's just racist. The implication is that because they're Palestinians, they're Arabs, they're brown people, they don't have that right, but the white oppressors do. Now let's talk about the scope of that right. It should be non-controversial that you cannot, under any circumstances, intentionally target innocent civilians. That's just absolutely prohibited by international law. But it even goes further than that. You also have to take measures when you're attacking military targets. And by the way, this principle that I'm about to articulate has been invoked against the Russian military repeatedly in the conflict in Ukraine by Western powers. It's all of a sudden evaporated now that Israel is devastating Gaza. And the principle is, even when you're targeting a military target, you're shooting for a military target, you have to take reasonable steps to minimize civilian casualties, and you cannot engage in acts of retaliation or violence that are disproportionate to the objective. So it can be criminal to kill civilians accidentally, negligently, or recklessly. You don't have to actually intend it. There is absolutely no question that Israel, at a bare minimum, is doing this recklessly, because just look at the photographs of Gaza. It's carpet bombing, entire neighborhoods in one of the most, if not the most densely populated part of the world, half of whose population, as I said, are children. And it's forcing them. It started by raising northern Gaza to the ground, telling them all to go south, packing them like sardines in the south, and then it started bombing the bejesus out of the southern part of Gaza. There's absolutely no question that Israel is violating the laws of war in its behavior. Absolutely no question. It has gone way beyond the bounds of the right of self-defense. It has made a mockery of the right of self-defense. And so here we have Western leaders, as you've indicated, effectively not just tolerating this, they're cheering it on. They're arming Israel. They're blocking meaningful action at the useless United Nations Security Council, just calling for a ceasefire, We can't even get a resolution calling for a ceasefire because of the United States and its allies from Western Europe, when it's absolutely clear that Israel has gone vastly beyond the right of self-defense and is committing heinous war crimes in Gaza. This is a, I felt embarrassed to be from the West, Regis, as I watched this horror in Ukraine unfold, because I could see that we provoked that war. I could see that it was going to end in the destruction of Ukraine. I could see that the lies, what we were being told about Western motivation for fueling that war was a pack of stinking lies. But this, I've never felt so ashamed to be from a Western country as I feel now, because this is a genocide. We're watching it happen in real time, and our governments are fueling the genocide.
Well, I share your views exactly. I want to ask you this. I would have to say that I've been also very pro-Palestine. The reason I say that is because the country, if you want to call it that, of Israel, artificially created in 1947, the Balfour Decision, created out of nothing, took this land where Palestinians had been for centuries and gave a part of Israel. Okay, you say, well, all right, maybe these Jews needed a homeland, the Israelis. But ever since that time, we have seen the Israelis expanding and bulldozing Palestinian towns, bulldozing and burning their olive groves, and creating their own settlements, and then putting walls around them, pushing Palestinians further and further out of what was their territory. Is this not an occupation? Is this not?
Of course, it's a, yeah.
A gross violation?
I just want to say.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the origins of this, and let me just say, you described yourself as pro-Palestinian. I often describe myself as pro-Palestinian. Lots of other people refer to me that way when we talk about this conflict, but it's actually a bit of a misnomer. And I suspect, Regis, that what I'm about to say you would agree with. I'm not pro-Palestinian per se. I'm pro-oppressed. I stand with the oppressed. Let's imagine that those 2.3 million people, one half of whom are children, were Jews, and that the people on the outside of the enclave, blasting it to smithereens and depriving it of the essentials of life, and destroying hospitals and ambulances and civilian convoys and murdering journalists, were Arabs. Okay, I would be pro-Jewish in that case. I would be, and if I had been alive during the Second World War, I would have been fanatically pro-Jewish because they were being wiped out by this murderous Nazi regime. So it's really a question of standing with the oppressed. It's not the question of standing with any particular ethnic group. So now we go back to the beginning of this whole mess. I've said this many times about Israel. We hear all of this, mythology that this was a land of sanctuary for the Jewish people after the Holocaust, and and they were coming back to their roots, and they are indigenous to this land, and they have a claim to it, a biblical commitment to it. And I'm sure that there are many people in the Jewish community, both inside and outside of Israel, who genuinely believe all of that. I don't believe for one second, however, that was the motivation for Western governments, including the British government and the American government. The American government was the first government to recognize Israel after it declared independence. I think it was like within 52 minutes they recognized it. The reality is this: Israel is a massive U.S. military base masquerading as a country. That's the reality. All the rest of this stuff is hokum. Again, I'm not denying that there are people in the Jewish community who genuinely have those feelings of attachment and do view Israel, rightly or wrongly, as a sanctuary for them. But that's not the motivation for creating it. They put this giant U.S. military base, created it. And Biden himself effectively admitted this many times. He said, If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it to protect our interests in the region. That's what he said. Alexander Haig, who I believe was the Secretary of State under Reagan, he said that Israel is the United States' unsinkable aircraft carrier. What does that tell you? That tells you that from their perspective, the ones who actually created Israel and sustain Israel, Israel is all about the projection of U.S. power into this region. And that's exactly the role that Israel has played over and over again. It's not just obliterating the Palestinian people. Anytime anybody gets out of line in the Middle East, for example, the Lebanese, the Syrians, the Iranians, anybody who doesn't want to be in Iraq when it was under the power of Saddam Hussein. Remember when it was bombed by Israel? They bombed a nuclear reactor in Iraq. This is what Israel has been doing for decades. It is the American hammer in the richest oil-producing region in the world. So that's what it is. And we need to understand that all began. We need to be cognizant of the real reason for Israel's creation and the function it's served ever since. But the other thing I want to say is, this war and the attack by Hamas has exploded this myth. It's just a myth that Jewish people are safer in Israel than they are elsewhere. Are you telling me, what rational person could claim with a straight face after what has happened over the past 2 weeks in Israel itself, that a Jewish person is safer there than they are, for example, in Brooklyn, New York, or they are in Paris, or they are in Frankfurt? This is nonsense. Israel is at risk right now of being obliterated by Hezbollah, by Iran. And by the way, it is bringing on their hatred. It's not as though it doesn't deserve the hostility of neighboring states. It has earned their hostility. I'm not saying I want it to be obliterated, but I'm saying they have put themselves in a position and their citizens in a position where they could suffer mass casualties precisely because of their policies and their behavior, including the dispossession of the Palestinian people. So this is no sanctuary for the Jewish people. It was never a sanctuary for the Jewish people, less so now than it has ever been. That was always hokum. It was always just mythology that was designed to justify the creation of this massive U.S. military base in this extraordinarily oil-rich region. And I think now more than ever, the reality of all of this is becoming apparent. And people better they better give their heads a shake, because this is heading towards the destruction of Israel. That's exactly where this is going to end if Israel isn't reined in real soon. I don't believe that the Arab states and that Iran and that Hezbollah and all these militant groups that are committed to the Palestinian people are going to sit back indefinitely and allow them to effectively be wiped out in Gaza. And it's not just Gaza, by the way. The settlers and the Israeli military are on a rampage in the West Bank. A rampage. The rampage people, just rounding people up with all kinds of bogus charges, massively putting them in jail. People are being tortured in jail. Settlers are torturing people. People are being run over. People are being, hit with rocks, being driven from their fields, having their olive groves burned. All over historic Palestine right now, there are the worst atrocities being perpetrated by this monstrous regime. And I think the world's at the end of their tether. And believe me, they have the power to destroy Israel. So safety for the Jewish people? I don't think so, especially if this continues. And in fact, we're all at risk. We're all at risk because this could easily spiral into a world war.
This was one of the first things that I thought, Dimitri, a couple of days after this thing happened, that Hezbollah was involved. Iran, obviously, very much involved. Israel's wanted to destroy Iran for a long time. When you look at the other countries that have an interest in this region, you have several countries that are nuclear armed. You have Pakistan, you have India, Russia even has nuclear weapons, the United States with those 2 aircraft carrier groups in the Mediterranean. Israel has the bomb. I wouldn't be surprised if Iran had some kind of a bomb. They certainly have thousands of missiles that could destroy Israel. And this is what I wondered. And I think this might be what you're getting at. The entire Arab and Muslim world, I do not believe can sit on the sidelines and do nothing for much longer with everything that's at stake. Your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the people I interviewed when I was in South Lebanon, Regis, was a man who lived in a village near the coast of Lebanon that it was actually on the blue line, the UN patrolled blue line between Israel and Lebanon. And he and his family had evacuated the village because of our Israeli shelling. And they were in the city of Tyre, the coastal city of Tyre, which is further up the road from the Israeli border. And they had been and by the way, Israel began shelling their village almost immediately after the October 7th attacks. They had been in this refuge for internally displaced people for 2 weeks in the city of Tyre. It was very disruptive to their lives. They had nothing. I mean, they were losing money. They couldn't do their jobs. They were worried about their homes. They didn't know what shape their homes were in. And this man sat there and he said to me, I asked him, why do you think they started shelling your village right after October 7th? He said, because we view the Palestinians as our brothers and sisters. And if you have any honor, you will defend them. And that's my first response to your question. If the governments of the Arab and Muslim world have any honor, they will put a stop to this genocide. They have to do it. All they got to do is say, we ain't sending you any gas and we ain't sending you any oil in the West if you continue to tolerate this monstrosity. If Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain and the Saudis and the Iranians, although their oil is under sanction in the West, it's not really them who can pull this trigger. It's the Gulf states. If they say we're not going to send oil or gas until you give justice to the Palestinian people and stop supporting Israel, the West is going to have to do it. It's as simple as that. They have the power, non-violently, to put a stop to this. And the fact of the matter is, whether they have that honor or not, these are people who care very deeply about their power and their wealth. And I saw a lot of anger in those streets, Regis, when I was in Lebanon. And I saw a lot more anger, watching television. Massive crowds showing up in Jordan, massive crowds in Morocco, in Tunisia, even in Libya, which is a devastating country. They were calling about expelling all Israeli diplomats from the country. The Saudis are worried. All of these, regimes whose leaders have accumulated great wealth, power, and prestige, whether or not they have the honor, they are threatened by extraordinary levels of anger and indignation in the streets. So their hand may be forced by the people. At the end of the day, I will allow this to go on much longer. This is going to come to it. Somebody's going to intervene in the Muslim world. And frankly, all it has to be, it doesn't have to be all those other states. If Iran and Hezbollah and the Syrian army and whatever proxy groups in Iraq and Syria that Iran influences or controls decide to intervene militarily, Israel is finished militarily. It'll suffer a strategic defeat. This pipsqueak of a country cannot defeat all those countries if they unite. Not now. Maybe it could have done that once. But militarily, they no longer have the capacity to resist all of those forces. And I just find it really difficult to believe that the Iranians are going to allow a genocide to happen.
Well,
I hope it doesn't come to war. I hope that they have a good sense to use their economic leverage to stop it.
There's two things I want to ask you about. First of all, the thing that terrifies me, like I'm right next door to this conflict in Ukraine. And for months now, both sides have been rattling the sabers about the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. Israel has a nuclear bomb. If Israel feels like extinction is a possibility, would they possibly, Netanyahu, push the button? I mean, I'm just really frightened about that. More frightened about the possibility of this serious escalation in the Middle East than I was about the escalation in Ukraine. Your thoughts on that? And then before we finish, I want to talk to you about, from a legal point of view, is the two-state solution, a two-state region, the solution to all of this? Your thoughts?
As I said, at the beginning when I talked about Netanyahu, this monster's capable of anything. Would he use a nuke? Yeah, I'm afraid to say that he would. And if anything is going to, there are two things that would restrain him. The one would be the U.S. government. If the U.S. government said, your use of a nuclear weapon would be the final nail in the coffin of U.S.-Israeli relations, and we will drop you like a hot potato, I don't think he would do it at that stage. He would know that, that it would effectively be the end of the state of Israel. I mean, he'd kill a lot of people, but the country would be an international pariah and would wither away very quickly. And he would be eventually captured and held accountable for his heinous war crimes if he did it. So if the U.S. tells him in no uncertain terms, we will abandon Israel if you do this, I don't believe he'll do it. The other thing that might deter him, I've heard, I haven't yet myself seen official statements from Pakistani officials to this effect, but I've heard several commentators say that Pakistan's military has threatened to nuke Israel if Israel nukes Iran. I think that would probably cause him pretty much rule out I don't think he's going to nuke Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is right on the border with Israel. There's no way for him to deploy a nuclear weapon, even a relatively low yield tactical nuclear weapon against Hezbollah, the area where Hezbollah's forces are concentrated, without killing a lot of people in Israel. So I think that. But would he attack Iran? Would he nuke Tehran? Yeah, unless the Americans stop him or he's dissuaded from doing so by a threat of nuclear retaliation from another state. I've been saying this for years. Regis, letting that murderous apartheid regime develop a nuclear arsenal was one of the craziest ass things the West has ever done. That was just insane. I mean, they're not even members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're the only country in the Middle East. Everybody talks about Iran getting the bomb, blah, blah, blah. Iran is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel isn't. There's really little insight. We know it has nukes. Exactly what kind of nukes and where they are and how powerful they are, we don't really know, because it's not subject to any kind of inspection to develop a nuclear arsenal. But we've allowed them to do that without any real oversight by the international community. That's just insanity.
Okay. Is the solution the two-state solution? Israel, Palestine. It seems to me that Israel does not want that to happen. I think they have plans to take over the entire region, including parts of Ukraine, where Jews have already set up shop with Israeli Jewish signs on the streets and on the shops. So, what is the solution to this, Dimitri? Do you think a two-state solution can really work? I don't think the United States really wants that. Certainly hasn't tried very hard to bring it about. But what are your thoughts?
Well, that's what the international community, through a great wealth of United Nations General Assembly resolutions and Security Council resolutions, has been calling for decades. The creation of a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders. Now, I think there's no prospect of that happening, frankly. I think the number of settlers who now live in the West Bank is in excess of 800,000 Israeli citizens of Jewish ethnicity have moved into the West Bank, settled in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as I mentioned, and they've built up entire cities, Regis, and the wall. I mean, I've been to the West Bank four times. It's appalling what they've done. They've literally created roads, for the Israeli citizens, the Jewish Israeli citizens who are there illegally, beautiful modern highways, and then the crappy little side roads are reserved for the Palestinians. And this wall has carved up Palestinian communities all over the place and pretty much isolated various of them. And so, how do you, practically speaking, create a truly sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank now that they've done this? And now that they're obliterating Gaza, which was the other part of Israel or Palestine, historic Palestine, that was supposed to be part of a new Palestinian state. I mean, they're turning it into a wasteland. So I think this is a practical impossibility. And the only real just alternative, is a single state solution in which everybody has equal rights and in which the Palestinian refugees are allowed to return. And what that means, let's be very clear, is that in all likelihood, the Palestinians would form a majority in that state, and it would look like a very different state. And I think, the international community should say, we demand that there be a constitution in place, that there be constitutional protection for minority rights. So whoever may be in the minority, their democratic rights will be preserved. The decisions of the legislature and the executive will be subject to judicial review by an independent judiciary. That's really the only just option at this stage, given what they've done to the West Bank, the Israelis. You mentioned the United States. Biden just gave some speech in which he said, we're not going back to the status quo, the pre-October 7th status quo. It's time for the Palestinian people to have a state. Do you believe him? I've got some bridge in Florida, swampland in Florida to sell to you. Why he wasn't lifting a finger during the time that he was the president of the United States to put a stop to the settlements, was putting absolutely no pressure on the Israelis to come to the negotiating table at all, let alone in a serious manner. He didn't give a damn about Palestinian statehood when he was the vice president for 8 years under Obama, who also allowed the settlements to expand relentlessly. Why would anybody believe this man? The United States, no one should take this seriously. The United States has absolutely no interest in ensuring, once the bloodbath has been suspended in Gaza, that the Palestinian people have a state. It's going to require other forces in the world to make that happen.
I'm going to be accused, I'm sure you have been accused, of being anti-Semitic for stating positions that are not favorable to Israel. Now, I want your thoughts on this before we finish tonight, Dimitri. I think that those people who are the power brokers in Israel are not the Israelites of the Old Testament. I happen to believe they are Khazarian Judeo-Turks. Based on my research, they are not true Israelites. They were an empire that commanded a lot of territory all over that region. And today, and I believe now for over 70 years, anti-Semitism has been used as a defense mechanism to discredit anybody who challenges who they are. I do not believe that the Israelites and their descendants from the Old Testament are at all related to these Khazarian monsters that have the whole world right now on the brink of extermination. Your thoughts on that, Dimitri? I may be totally off base, but those are my thoughts.
Well, I know that his name escapes me now, but there was an Israeli academic who published an analysis of the origin of the Jewish Israeli population, the predominant origin. And as I recall, his theory was that they came principally from Kazan in Russia, and that they had been converted to Judaism centuries ago. I honestly, Regis, I'm in no position. I don't know enough about that subject to offer an opinion about that at all. Uh, and frankly, I don't think that it particularly matters. The fact of the matter is that there are people in, what is historic Palestine, now Israel, and occupied Palestinian territories, who are profoundly committed to Judaism and consider themselves, with every fiber of their being, to be Jewish. And there are people who consider themselves and are truly committed to the belief that they are Palestinian. There are Muslims, there are Christians, people who are very genuine in their belief. And we are drawing, or not we, I don't want to include you and me in this, and a hell of a lot of other people in the West, but the governments of Israel and the West are drawing distinctions between people in this particular country and in these occupied territories based upon claims of ethnicity and religion. And those distinctions are leading to discrimination. It's fine to have the distinctions as long as you ensure equal treatment of all these people. But in the case of Israel, those who identify as Palestinian, whether or not their belief that they're Palestinian is warranted, and those who identify as Jewish, whether or not they believe that they're Jewish, whether or not that belief is warranted, they're being treated in a very differential manner, and the Palestinians are being basically deprived of their basic democratic rights. That's what concerns me. I'm not particularly concerned about, the genetic origin of these people or what particular part of the world that they came from. That really is what equality is really what should guide us in responding to this. And I want to say, something about anti-Semitism. Yes, I have been accused many times by supporters of Israel of anti-Semitism. I was accused by the current Prime Minister of Canada of being an anti-Semite. And the reason why he accused me of that is because I said that two politicians in his caucus, who happen to be Jewish, and who at one of them is now no longer in Parliament, but one of them remains in Parliament. These two are fanatically devoted to Israel, in my opinion, and so much so that when a friend of mine, a Canadian Palestinian doctor, was shot by an Israeli sniper in Gaza, and it's one of those rare occasions in our country where that elicited a condemnation of Israel's government by the Canadian Prime Minister, they actually parted company with their own prime minister, and they defended Israel's actions. And at that point, I came out and I said, these people are putting the interests of Israel ahead of the interests of Canada. And for this, I was accused by the Prime Minister of anti-Semitism. Let me say unequivocally, I don't think that this kind of behavior, I never believed for 1 second that the kind of behavior we're seeing from the state of Israel is somehow of the most basic principles of Jewish identity and the Jewish religion. And I say that not because I'm Jewish, I'm not, but because I've worked with hundreds of members of the Jewish community from Canada, the United States, Europe, other parts of the world, in solidarity with the Palestinian people to achieve justice for the Palestinian people. So I know from personal experience over a period of years how many conscientious Jews that there are out there who are struggling and devoting enormous amounts of their time and energy and passion to achieving justice for the Palestinian people. The problem that the Jewish community, the diaspora, confronts is that Western governments and the Israeli government keep telling the world that Israel is the Jewish state and that it speaks for the Jewish people. It doesn't. It doesn't speak for the Jewish people. I don't believe that for 1 second. And there are millions of Jews out there who will tell you that they emphatically disagree with the Israeli government's behavior and disavow any claim that it speaks on their behalf. But when you hear this all the time, when you hear constantly people saying Israel speaks for the Jewish people, Israel is the Jewish state, and then you see it committing these monstrosities, you're going to end up generating a considerable amount of anti-Semitism. So these people, it's not me, it's not you, it's not people out there who are pro-Palestinian, who are criticizing Israel. We're not the ones who are causing the problem with anti-Semitism. It's the defenders of Israel and the Israeli government who are exacerbating anti-Semitism because they're lying to the world and claiming that what they do is on behalf of the Jewish people.
I was born and raised Catholic and had been part of that religious group for most of my adult life. The Holy Land is respected by the three major Abrahamic religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Muslims. They existed for centuries in peace and harmony. I now am living in Russia, and President Putin just yesterday, it might have been today, I'm not sure exactly the date, called together the heads of these three major religions and reminded all of them how they have coexisted in Russia, not like apartheid, separate and living in their own areas, but they've collaborated with each other. They've supported each other over many, many decades and centuries. And I think for the longest time, Dimitri, that was how the Holy Land, Jerusalem, was seen by these three major religions. It's called the Holy Land for a reason. And, you know, I think with the creation of the Israeli state, as you mentioned, I think did a great deal of harm to ruining that respect and harmony among those three major religious beliefs. Your final thoughts before we finish.
I want to go back to what I said earlier. You know, Israel, I think the way to properly conceive of Israel is as a gigantic U.S. military base masquerading as a country. There's absolutely no reason, none whatsoever, why Jewish people, Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, peoples of all faiths and all ethnicities can't live in peace and harmony in the Holy Land. There's zero reason. It's happened before for prolonged periods of time, and it could absolutely happen again. The problem is that the United States, the real democracy in Israel, or what we formerly called Palestine, it doesn't want there to be real equality, because if you actually had a democratic society in that part of the world, whose government did the will of the people, they'd kick the Americans out. They would kick out the American military forces, and they'd say, "You're not going to tell us what to do. We're not going to be your hammer in the region. We want to live in peace with our neighbors. We don't want war. We don't want to spend massive amounts of money on military and put ourselves at risk. We don't need nuclear weapons." That's what a democratic society that was committed to humane principles, situated in the Holy Land, I strongly believe, would tell the United States government. So the United States government wants nothing to do with that. This all is the fault of the United States government and its Western vassals, particularly the British. This is why this division exists, this hatred and this violence. And the sooner they get their asses kicked out of the Middle East, Regis, the happier the peoples of the Middle East will be. Jews, Muslims, Christians, non-religious persons. They need to rid themselves of the pestilence of Anglo-American imperialism.